Committee CM 25-1 and welcome you to it. And we have Zoom, we have Rodney Joyce, we have Grant Daly, and we have Danny Simpson all on Zoom. Not that we can see you at the moment. Can you hear us? Right. That's
yes.
Promising, Robin. Yes. And I'll call for apologies. Laura, have you got two?
Yes. Apology for Tiffany Hopping and Cassie Ellis, please.
Thank you. And the seconder, Alan Sol, will put that motion in favour, will say aye. Against, carried. The karakia. Settle the spirit, clear the mind, prepare the body to achieve what needs to be achieved. Yes. Thank you. And then, has anybody got a declaration of a conflict of interest? No? Any consideration of late items? Robin? No? Good morning, Rodney. You're in full view of everybody. Oh, welcome, Chris. Welcome. You've just arrived in time. And public excluded items, there are none. Is there anyone speaking in public forum? There is not. And so we move to the reports on page 7. Jodie, would you like to introduce this, please? Or Lisa?
Kia ora. Yeah, so I just have the report for Pestary Parks proposal that was initially presented in June Community Committee last year to be scoped. So now I'm returning with the scope. Next page, Robin, please. So the purpose of this report is just to present the Pestary Parks strategy and the associated action plan for adoption. Next, please. So the overview of Pestary Parks is that it's inspired by Predator Free 2050. It's about collective action with council and communities and in a localised way, as opposed to Predator Free 2050, which is national. It aligns to our strategic direction and national goals, in particular the natural environment and sustainable living activity. Next, please. So the work that I've undertaken, just a bit of an overview there. So unfortunately, it doesn't quite fit on the screen, but this is what we've established as our current operating environment for pest control on council-owned or managed reserves. So this helps us to understand where we can improve or adjust our pest management within our current operating budgets. You can go into more detail on that if you would like, but it's quite complicated. But it's essentially most of it is driven by the regional pest management plan from Regional Council, and we have our day-to-day maintenance contract, which looks after the exclusion and eradication and progressive containment species. What isn't covered in the day-to-day maintenance contract is the advisory or sustained control pest species, and those are usually the species that people will know of because they're quite prolific in the district because they aren't managed. They're kind of beyond control, and that's why they're classified as advisory and sustained. So that's where we think Pestary Parks will be best suited in aiming to work towards removing and controlling advisory pests and sustained control pests as much as possible. Next, please. So the overall outcomes, I guess in summary of...
One moment, Councillor Coxhead.
So just for clarity and just so I make sure I understand it. So currently all this is handled in-house, correct?
Yes, mostly. If we go back a slide there, it shows that a lot of so all of the stuff that's handled in-house is progressive containment species. So those are the species such as gorse or ginger or wallabies are classed as progressive containment because they're quite low in numbers and deemed possible to achieve eradication for. However, the species that you usually think of as problems like rats, mustelids, and moth plant or privet, that's not covered in-house, but we have a really strong volunteer network in our reserves working on those a lot, and our reserves team do support them quite considerably. But yeah, in terms of labour and a lot of that, that's really the volunteers that are driving that.
So if we're looking at more of that by the advisory piece, is the pest management thing? Yeah. So if we're looking at more of that being it's currently being handled by the volunteers anyway. Is it still going to be voluntary going forward, or are we looking at transfer of funds?
No, yeah. So we are still 100% wanting to engage in increase volunteer engagement. This is not about us increasing funds. Pest-free Parks is about doing what we can with our current budgets. And so we are just looking at this in a more strategic manner across the district about where we can make some big gains without actually increasing budgets. And a lot of that will be, actively trying to get more volunteers or building capacity and capability within the existing volunteers on our reserves.
Thanks for clarifying.
Would you tell us what the existing budget is that you have to work with?
Yes, I do have that, but I don't know that off the top of my head. I do know that we were looking at about depending on how you cut it, 1 to 7% of our budget is looking after pest control at the moment. But it's quite hard and it's not straightforward to there's no pest budget, so it's quite hard to cut out what actually is spent on pests. And of that, yeah, it's less than 1% that's actually spent on pest animal management. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, that's out of the facilities and reserves budgets. So we're in this scope, we're suggesting that we are going to be using budgets from the community team, potentially support, other teams can support like animal services and stuff with education and stuff.
Councillor Scribner.
I think you possibly half answered it, Liesl, but I think it would be fair to say, would it not, that the money for these programs comes from other budgets, principally roading and reserves and so on. Is that correct?
Yeah, so most of this will be coming out of the reserves budget. Yeah, there is some roading and utility reserves that are kind of considered recreation reserves, but the budgets would come from roading and utilities.
Right, Mayor Denyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to ask this later, but it seems an opportune time. So the question I had is when we're talking about reprioritising budgets, where's the money coming from to do that in terms of what are we not going to be doing to allow us to do this?
Yeah, I think a lot of the budget isn't so much that there's going to be a huge amount of reprioritizing budget. It's just about using it more effectively and efficiently. For example, the volunteer, like if we can engage the volunteers, we can get a lot of bang for buck, and a lot of this will be just the volunteers are really behind this, the community is really behind it from the engagement that we've had so far. So I think there'll be a lot of bang for buck in that sense. But yeah, if we're talking strictly about the reserves budget, yes, you could say that there would be some budget would be pulled away from the other day-to-day operations. And in terms of my budgets, it would mean that I'd be using some budget towards Pest-free Parks that could have gone to other areas of the district, but it's still being used for environmental outcomes and community benefits. So it's still achieving the same things. It's just going to be a bit more focused on reserves.
So if I can just push you or clarify a little bit, there's nothing we're going to notice that's a service that's been decreased somewhere, or that's no longer being done because it's been pushed.
No, that's not what I'm suggesting. Yeah. In the action plan, there is kind of an indication roughly of where we expect the budgets to come from for the tasks. Yeah, so a lot of it will be, like communications, for example, and working with agencies to align their work programs that currently exist to sort of pivot them in a little way to be able to work alongside Peace Free Parks and so on.
Thank you.
Member Clements.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks, Diesel. Just a quick question. Does your budget come from Parks and Reserves, or from which budget does it come?
No, I'm in the community and strategic relationships team, so I have a separate budget for community.
So what part of the Parks and Reserves budget goes towards to pest plant management? And secondly, what part of their budget goes to native plant biodiversity, improving the biodiversity of plants?
So are you asking what currently goes towards those?
Yes, both. What goes to pest plant management within that, and what goes to native plant increased biodiversity increases within their budget?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think what happens at the moment is that there's some stuff that happens within a capital works project. So Waitokohikohe Reserve, for example, will happen, and there'll be native tree planting that happens as part of that. I think in terms of the pest plant maintenance or management, that comes under the maintenance contracts, and that's, as Liesl said, is around about probably 1 to 7%. The situation with the budgets at the moment, and I think this is what we're sort of trying to address, is that it's not strategic how they're used. It's kind of on a case-by-case basis, or one-off, or things happening over there, some spend over there, some spend over there, and there's no strategic framework for how those are being used. So what Pest Free Parks does is kind of creates that strategic framework. So it's not new money, it's not new, it is kind of a reprioritization, but more in terms of just being more purposeful and more strategic in how those funds are deployed, I guess would be the best way to describe it.
All right. Next one is Alan, Councillor Sol, then Councillor Henry, then Councillor Ray.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The first thing I've got to say is it's darn good to see different thinking coming through. It's one of the things I look for is taking what we're doing and maybe turning it upside down and having a look at what that does. And so I've got to congratulate everybody that's worked on this for coming up with a new way or another way of dealing with an issue. And some of my other comments mightn't quite seem as friendly or nice, but I really actually appreciate that. I believe that's what's missing in a lot of the issues that we have. And I mean, that's even nationally, whatever, worldwide. I just believe we should look at things from other angles, and you've done well. But seeing as how we're just on the budgetary side has sort of come up, 1 to 7% is really quite, and it does concern me, and I would just suggest that perhaps this perhaps progresses along, that we have a little more focused or fixed amount, and where it's coming from really come forward. That is quite a broad area for people to express and manage and put forward governance. It's pretty wide, okay? So just in the future, I know what you're dealing with and I appreciate it, but somehow I think we need to be a little more accurate or within a ballpark. And I'll leave it at that at present, Madam.
Thank you. Councillor Henry.
Yeah, so I see this as an overarching view of pest management across Western Bay District Council. And you are actually, this is putting a priority on it. And what I see from what I can gather what you've said, that this is looking at all areas where pest plants, are likely to be found within different projects within council. So you'll be dipping into different I can't think what you mentioned other things. Jodie, help me on that. You know what I mean. So you've got a role as a community, but you will also come within other projects that are happening, which have all happened in isolation and in the past, but now it's coming under an umbrella, which has got some person who is directing. Is that how I understand it? Yes. And that is perfect. Thank you. And you mentioned volunteers, and yes, volunteers play a huge part in this. So are you because I know that we had a person who was employed for that, and I'm not sure that I know they've gone. Has that been replaced?
Councillor Henry, could you just pull that mic closer to
Is
you?
the volunteers role, has that person been replaced? Is that role still currently going?
Yes.
And do they work right across the role here? Do they?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's cool. So that's all my positive. I do have a little bit of a negative, and it's a bugbear from way back from my ancestors in Gorse. And I don't believe you've mentioned that Western Bay is responsible for that. I don't believe Western Bay are actually doing a good job in that area. And I'm wondering in your role, whether you would be able to follow up for me that the gorse that's growing between Island View and Bowen Town had a 5-year input from Regional Council to try and eradicate the gorse. Can you follow up with me for me how that's going, and how Western Bay are going to be able to take over that area?
Yeah. Yeah, I can follow that up for you. It is a very difficult weed to eradicate. Yeah.
I've lost sight of what happened with that with Brendan.
That's one time a service request, a follow-up service request would be worthwhile. Do Councillor Henry? I've got Councillor Ray.
Thank you. So firstly, I love this report. It absolutely screams to me all the things that all of our Taiao teams have been asking for many, many years. I just wondered though, is there any room within this scope to add any further pest plants to it? Or is it only going to be the sort of regional known ones?
So within the regional plan, that is every weed known to the Bay of Plenty and everyone that is potential threat to the Bay of Plenty. So all the advisory and sustained control weeds pretty much cover every weed that you would see on a day-to-day basis. So that is within the scope currently.
Okay,
Yeah.
yay. Thank you.
I'll take 2 more questions and then we'll complete the report, and then we'll have an in-depth discussion at that point, I think. Who have we got? Rodney. Welcome, Councillor Joyce.
Yep. Actually, I was going to withdraw and wait for the discussion. But I know there's one weed that's not on there, that's not on the noxious list, that is a particular issue in our parks because it grows over everything, and that's kikuyu. Yeah, it's and I think you've already answered that for Councillor Ray, that we're sort of sticking to this list at the moment. But it does seem to be one that is climbing over everything all over our parks. Did I just room to include that?
Yes, I believe that's an advisory pest, which is within scope.
Councillor Daly.
Yeah, Lisa, I was just wondering what exactly the current reserve management contracts specify in terms of pest plant control, if you've got an idea of the extent that the contractor is supposed to go to try and deal with this problem.
Yes, so the current contract for day-to-day maintenance only covers progressive containment weeds and animals, not that there's very many animals within that. And that's pretty much just woolly nightshade, gorse, ginger, realistically that happen on our reserves. So yeah, it's just the progressive containment species. Exclusion and eradication, if we were to identify any of those species on our reserves, that would be controlled by regional council or MPI.
So are you saying that if we find some, we just have to keep it in check but not try and eradicate it, and then regional council might put an order out to do something, or do they have a separate budget to do that themselves?
So there's some species called, which are classified eradication or exclusion. So that means they're not in the district, or it's deemed achievable to eradicate them if they're already here. And they're the species that you almost will never see. There's one case of Sylvania in the Waihi Beach Dam. There might be one or two other cases on our reserves, but they're very uncommon. And that's why they're considered exclusion or eradication. And MPI or regional council will manage those responses because they need to be managed properly. So if you were ever to come across those species, then it needs to be reported. Yeah, but if it's progressive containment and you see it on reserves, then that should be managed by the contract currently, and you could put in a service request for them to follow up and get on top of that.
Right, thank you. I said those were the last two questions, but I've got two desperate ones here. Member Clements.
Desperate. Now, mine's following from Rodney, but agapanthus as well. I noticed that's not on the list, and yet that is regarded as a weed. Any comment on the Kikuyu agapanthus?
Are you referring to the list in the appendix of sustained control weeds? So there's also a list of advisory pests, and I believe that agapanthus is within that list. So the regional pest management plan covers every pest, animal and pest plant known to the regional council. So they're all within scope.
Thank you. And Councillor Coxhead?
I was just wondering, in terms of have you approached, or have we been approached by any new volunteer groups that have wanted to participate in this yet at this point?
And pest-free parks? And participate in pest-free parks? No, not as such, but I did 5 workshops across the district with all the known volunteers. Well, they were all invited and we did have good attendance. They've all had a resounding yes, they would support this and would be very happy to continue to do so and potentially increase what they're doing. And part of that, they've also indicated that they would really like to get more volunteers involved. And part of one of the actions in our proposed plan is also to increase volunteer engagement through a few mechanisms in areas that we see the need for more volunteers. But yeah, I can imagine, we hope that, yeah, but pest-free parks hasn't started yet, obviously, so we haven't really had that opportunity to engage new volunteers yet.
Right, thank you. Just continue with the report, thank you.
Cool, okay. So yes, the outcomes that we hope to achieve within this plan, in summary, is essentially that we'll have better social cohesion and environmental outcomes, increased biodiversity on our council reserves, increased community participation and engagement with our council reserves, and increased participation and engagement with iwi and hapu, and building capacity within those communities. Next slide, please. So this has kind of been touched on already. So the scope is that it would be council-owned and managed reserves. This will also include the Esplanade reserves and, where appropriate, roading and utility reserves, as many of them are kind of, there is some examples of those where they are treated like recreation reserves, and our reserves team do already look after the day-to-day maintenance of them on behalf of roading and utilities. So it was deemed appropriate for some of those reserves to be included. As I've mentioned, every pest within the regional pest management plan will be included. Out of scope is council land that is not identified as a reserve or not owned or managed by council. Indigenous species specific management is not included. So that's where, for example, the Department of Conservation manage kiwis and so on. So we're not talking about management of Indigenous species. And we're also not including conservation enhancement projects. So it's strictly pest management. It's not about planting new trees or doing other conservation kind of projects.
Thank you. Councillor Coxhead, you had a question?
Sorry, I'm becoming a repeat offender. So Kiwi Rail obviously own a lot of land that's covered in multitudes of different pest type plants. So is there any way we can put extra pressure on them as well?
Yeah, I mean, the hope is with something like Pest Free Parks is that we kind of draw attention to these issues and we start behaving as the good neighbour, and, you know, it puts pressure on other agencies to be a good neighbour to us, because if we're doing the control and then next door they're kind of the seed source or something, then yes, that is definitely something that we would hope. It's not definitive in the action plan that we've set out for the next couple of years, but could definitely be included.
Feel like there is, particularly, I'm just thinking one example, but you know, it's out of control, and getting them to do anything has been a real issue. And it really does kind of undo the good work you're doing in some respects if it's affecting where you're working as well. I just wonder if maybe we do need to have a bit more of a focus on getting them to do their part.
Yeah, there is a couple of examples, and there's a group called Waikokupu that are doing similar work in their catchment and have successfully engaged KiwiRail to do pest control. So, you know, I think just by starting and us doing what we can definitely leverage that for other agencies to do the same.
Mayor Dinya.
Thank you. I just want to check, because you say out of scope is council land not identified as reserve. Now, in theory, Waikato is not a reserve as such as fee simple. So we might just want to clarify whether something like that is, we would want to include it, but because it's held fundamentally as forestry rather than a reserve, we just want to make sure it's not caught out.
Jodie.
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. That is why we've used the wording not identified as a reserve as opposed to classified as a reserve. So we have areas that are held in fee simple, that anybody looking at them would say are a reserve, and they use them in that way, but we haven't done an official classification under the Reserves Act. So that's why the wording there is identified, not classified.
Right. Is that it? That's the report.
Oh, sorry, no, sorry. I thought that was the answer.
Margaret.
Sorry, Councillor Daly.
Oh, yep. Thank you, Margaret. Just to double down on the Tracy's question about the KiwiRail land. I mean, obviously, you know, I'm a member of Te Arakika Te Pathway Society in Te Puke, and part of our walkway goes under two KiwiRail bridges, and you know, we've formalised the agreement with KiwiRail to access those pathway portions that are in the corridor, and they are very punitive on their annual lease agreement. There's a ratchet clause for the rent, which sort of goes up, I think, 5% per annum on a 10-year deal, and yet they have got a consistent no maintenance policy, almost, you'd think, because there's woolly nightshade growing all over the privet and other bushes that grow in the corridor that they don't seem to show much interest in maintaining, and yet that has a spillover effect onto our reserve, like Lawrence Oliver Park in Te Puke, for example. I could show you pictures of woolly nightshade that's you know, encroaching on our reserve. So I think there's a good opportunity to maybe get some sort of either acknowledgement of the problem through either a contract back arrangement from KiwiRail or a reduction in the actual annual lease to you know, be using that corridor. We don't want to obviously get to the situation where they ban us completely from their corridors, but working in partnership would make much better outcomes, especially in these pest-free plant situation. And I know there's corridors on the Omokoroa cycle trail as well that have to utilise the KiwiRail corridor, so it can't be just our little rohi. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Councillor Daly. What you prove is there is a need, and that has been recorded. So if you could continue, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So up on the screen is our council-led strategies. So just to quickly kind of go over them, the first step that we would be taking is a district-wide assessment of all identified reserves that are within the scope, and therefore creating a plan around each of those reserves and what's needed to be able to achieve what we would consider a pest-free park status. So there would be levels within that, and each reserve would have its own sort of roadmap to get there. And some of that might mean that, we identify that there's no volunteers there, and that's the priority for that reserve, is to help increase the volunteer engagement in that reserve. Or it might be that there's another area where council's already doing significant pest plant work alongside some volunteers, but there's no pest animal work, and that might be a priority for that specific reserve. Following that, we've got goals around how we will deliver those. So we have identified that we need to build capacity within the existing reserve volunteers. So as I've mentioned, there's plenty of them, but there's always more that could be done around increasing numbers, their skill level, their ability to control what they want to control and what they want to do. As I've mentioned, we have little to no pest animal control on our reserves delivered by council. Most of it is done by volunteers, and there's huge opportunity to improve on that and get some great outcomes that would be significant to our Indigenous biodiversity. We would increase community interest and support for conservation outcomes in council reserves. So that's about attracting volunteers to reserves that don't have a long-standing volunteer group, and there's a few mechanisms around that. So it might be just holding one-off working bees once a year, or proactively trying to get some locals working in that reserve. Internal alignment and elevation of pest-free parks into council work. So that's socialising it internally across other teams. There's a lot of other teams that can significantly engage in this program, such as the animal services team potentially could do some education around responsible dog control or cat control, just to raise awareness around those species and what the impact they can have on our reserves. We'll obviously create a pest-free park sub-brand and the comms plan that goes alongside that. And when appropriate, and as it comes up, we will develop a Mātauranga Māori approach in partnership with iwi hapu, Haura, so on. And we will create a monitoring baseline so we can actually measure what we're achieving or not achieving, and then change each year based on that.
Right, Councillor Granger.
I'm intrigued about point 7. I don't understand how there can be a traditional historical Maori understanding of pests that weren't here until the colonialists brought them here.
I think there's more opportunity around the like social cohesion or the outcomes around connecting people to nature and the well-being, so that how that can improve your health. So we've been speaking to Haora around that a lot specifically, and they're quite interested in connecting people back to those reserves. A lot of those reserves are obviously quite significant to them, and there'll probably be more around that side of things than actual pest management necessarily.
Councillor Granger raises a really good point in that who is actually in control at the end of the day? Is it this committee, or is it not necessarily a committee of council? How is it responsible back to the community if you're subletting everything out to the wider community? For example, number 7 doesn't make sense to me. You have to have an authority at the top to make sure that there's a balance happening out there in the community. Do we not, Jody?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think the point of number 7 is that this is where we can work with iwi and hapu and do that connection to the reserves that are important to them, sites of cultural significance that Lisa was talking about. So that's essentially like if you look at Anzac Bay, for example, in Waihi Beach, and the really significant cultural site that is, and how then the management of that reserve works alongside Te Whānau Taufao in their approach with their piece of land right next to that reserve, which is part of that cultural heritage site there. So it's not handing over control or changing anything in that sense. It's about how we partner and create good relationships and good connections to those spaces so that the value of them can actually increase, and I guess they can be contributing even more to those local communities than they currently do.
So when you look at Tuapiro and the development of that park there, obviously Tangata Whenua will be heavily involved in the development of the PA site. Is that the sort of thing you're thinking about?
Yes, that's it exactly. Yes.
Thank you. If you'd like to continue, I don't think sorry, Councillor Sol.
Thank you, Madam. Couple of things, and I'll go to that one in particular as well. It's quite a very sort of soft Maori description, you know, what it is. So basically working with how Maori have dealt with the issues over the years, really, and I think you've left enough scope. But yes, it's still a question we need to ask as to where it went, and I think that's been answered by Jody. My interest is then back to undertake the assessment, etc., and also then getting into a branding and so on. Again, you can't do this thing without changing it, but I am interested as to how and what sort of budget we are putting into, in particular, the assessment, and who is going to be doing it, because that's huge work. That is enormous work, and to have the expertise in there doing it, where that's going to come from and how we pay for it.
Yes, so yes, we did consider this quite heavily, and whether it was within our budgets. There is already a lot of work that's been undertaken just throughout the scoping phase, and then the Reserves Volunteer Coordinator has been doing some of this work as well to help with his work program. So, a good portion of it's already been done, and we will just be kind of tailoring it to meet the needs of Pestary Parks. So I'll be overseeing that project, and it will be within my work program.
Councillor Ray.
Sorry, last question. Do we know how many reserves we have currently? No.
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, we do, but Lisa and I don't have that number in front of us right now, but we can bring that back to you because it's all set out in our reserve management plans. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Councillor Henry.
Well, you will add in and make a distinctive number perhaps of perceived, or whatever the word was, ones that are not labelled as reserves but are used as reserves. So would you do that separately? So we know that how many of those we've got?
Through you, Madam Chair, most of those reserves are actually also covered in our reserve management plans. Where there are ones that are not, then yes, they would definitely be within that assessment area.
Mayor Denyer.
Councillor Ray's benefit, there are management plans in place for 222 reserves across the Western Bay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll continue. That's okay.
You're ready to take questions?
Oh, no, I've just got a couple more. Nearly there. So just quickly, the council, so the community-led strategy, sorry. So this is, I want to be very clear, we've engaged with the reserve volunteers already and a number of agencies that we seem deemed sort of important or aligned to Pestary Parks. And this is what they have told us they want to do and that they or are already doing. So we're not asking them to do anything in addition, it's their indications here. So they've all resoundingly said they would like to champion and promote Pestary Parks to the wider community to increase engagement. They hope that by aligning to a strategic goal like Pestary Parks, they'll be able to leverage that to attract external investment. So we can be essentially receiving more funding for our reserves through them and the work that they do and the funding that they can attract.
Then the Kaimai Mamaku Trust is one that's had significant money from central government. And I noticed that you've got them involved here. Are they expecting to be paid for anything that they're doing? And if they're not, where are they getting their money from?
No, no one has asked specifically for additional budget from council for pest-free parks, including Manaki Kaimamamuku Trust. And yeah, they're still working through what they're going to do with their funding now that the Jobs for Nature funding is ending. And yeah, they will probably have to bring in their, reduce their work program because of it.
So you're expecting them to do more for us, but they've got less funding coming for them.
They've mostly said that they would just support our champion the cause and promote it and advocate for it is essentially what they've indicated their support would be, which would be sort of wouldn't require any additional budgets. It was within their current work program that they would be able to do so.
I thought when I read the report, it would be wonderful if they were linking in through to the Blade in Whakamarama, or if they were linking through to Ngāmuahini to the school camp. They're all entrances into the Kaimai-Mamaku Forest Park, and I'm sure Karikari have also got great entrances into that. There is a great need, and I'm not quite sure that how you can cooperate and coordinate them, but is that the areas that you see them being involved?
It's more about their support of the program. So if they'll champion, the program, they probably won't be doing anything on the ground as such because they work in the Kaimai-Mamaku estate, which is obviously dockland primarily. Of course, there's a couple of examples.
So what are you saying they will do?
Champion and promote the strategy, so they'll support it through that.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll also be partnering, they've also, and social wellbeing agencies have also indicated that they're quite supportive of this. So I've mentioned Hoora, for example, where they can align their existing programs to pest-free parks, particularly around that connecting to nature and getting people back into nature and educating them about it, which we know means that they learn, once they learn and care about it, then they're more likely to protect it. They've indicated they would like to educate the wider community generally on the impact of and identification of pest species and the impact that they could then be having on our reserves and the species, Indigenous species. And then just in general, they've all indicated they would align their existing programs to be able to support pest-free parks. So an example of that is that EnviroHub has a wipeout moth plant competition that runs primarily through the district, and they do that for any land and through their competition, but with their alignment to pest-free parks, they could particularly focus on encouraging people to do the competition within our reserves. Next slide, please. Yeah, so we'll just go to the next slide as well. We've covered that one. So the recommendation is that council adopts the pest-free park strategy and its associated action plan. And that's it.
Member Clements and then Councillor Coxhead and then the Mayor.
Thanks, Liesl. And just to one quick comment before I go on to the main body. I went through the Waitokohiko Reserve, and whilst there've been trimmings and pruning of radiata, you'd left black wattle behind. And I just think, you know, here we are trimming, we got everyone out on the ground, but whoever did the pruning didn't even bother to touch the black wattle. And I just kind of go, well, and it's right next to it. I mean, it's literally within half a metre of the radiata tree. So I think we need to alert our contractors to those opportunities, which are easy wins for everyone. The other one is that, in fact, I recently ran a workshop for cluster development, and it goes back to this national development of what would be an economic cluster and jobs for Karikari. And one of them was, in fact, native plants, or that in that scope. And the national policy is around increasing native plants, natural vegetation. So is it possible to turn the policy around to say we will have a native plant policy rather than just controlling pest plants? In other words, pest plants would become an outcome of a native plant policy. So we encourage Indigenous planting in our parks and reserves policy. And I'm not sure if you do have a policy on native plant plantings within parks and reserves. What percentage is it? Like, that's a question. And then to go a bit further than that, in fact, we have, there is some strategic land which goes back to this Waikato area as well, which is just next to the Uretara River. And it was meant to go to housing, but it's now deemed marginally housing land. And I have proposed that that becomes a botanical garden for native plants. And in that way, we start to promote native plants, getting rid of kikuyu, all of those things, and it becomes a tourist attraction for the district in terms of what we are promoting. Because so that's one suggestion, is actually to flick the whole policy around being positive rather than just defensive about pest plants. The other one, you talked about resources and advocacy. We have to think of ways of making environmental movements cash positive. And that's what the whole workshop and cluster workshop is about, is how do we flip it around so they're commercially viable, whatever the government policy is. And I think that's what we need to think about as well. When we go to advocacy, it's not just about advocacy, it's about resources. And social enterprises need money. And if they can make it themselves, then strategically they become sustainable in their own right, rather than just depending on handouts. They can get the handouts as well, but being sustainable is important. And what are you doing in that space? So can you just elaborate, flicking the whole thing around? Your comments on that, please.
Yeah, so about changing it from to a more positive approach, we did consider that, and there was a little bit of feedback around pest-free parks sort of being seen as negative, but ultimately, throughout all the engagement and the work that we did, we decided that pest-free parks was quite tangible and understandable, and really kind of, people could understand it. And in terms of changing the approach to doing more plantings, that is quite, there's already so much plantings and native vegetation that need to be protected, and there's quite a cost around doing so. So by increasing the amount of vegetation, we would only be increasing the costs and the work to manage those sites as well. So that's why we're trying to just control and look after what we've already got and protect it as much as possible, because the damage that, browsers, pest animals and weeds can do to those sites is quite significant, and it's a lot of work just to keep them healthy as it is. So that's why we've decided to go with the way what we're doing. Of course, more plantings is always good. We're never going to not encourage that. But that's why we've chosen that approach. And in terms of it's in terms of how we address the need for social enterprises and making the sector more profitable, it's an ongoing discussion. There is some work being undertaken by a few agencies locally to do so, but it's very complicated, as I'm sure you're aware. And I think it's beyond what pest-free parks can probably address at this point.
So tell me, as you look for outside funding, which is what you've got here, you're obviously of the view that you haven't got enough, and that in the future you will need to actually look for outside funding as well.
Through you, Madam Chair, just to clarify, the slide that said that there would be external funding sought was for the community-led actions. So what the volunteer groups have said to Liesl is that if there's a pest-free parks platform that they're working from, they will be able to leverage from that to get external funding to support their work. It's not about council seeking external funding
so
to support.
On behalf of the Omokoro Enhancement Environmental Group, do they get funding at the moment from council?
Yes, they've got a service delivery contract in place for a volunteer coordinator.
Right. And that's working really successfully.
It's very early days. It's only a few months in, but it seems to be working really well at the moment.
Councillor Coxhead.
Oh, I think you partially answered my question anyway around the social enterprise, and in the theme of social wellbeing as well. Just I guess there would be opportunities for the likes of the people that used to work at Avalon, for example, and that type of thing. Would be great to see them employed as well, wouldn't it? Given that they haven't got a home to go to anymore.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's definitely identified in the action plan about working in with groups like that and sort of not those typical environmental groups, but like neighborhood support or something, because, you know, neighborhood support is actually about building kind of community connection, not just about crime. And so they've actually indicated they'd be quite keen to just get people together a bit more. And this could be an avenue that they could do that. Yeah.
Councillor Henry? I've got a few more questions first. I've got Mayor Denyer.
Thank you. A couple of points for me. So just an answer to Member Clements, policy 22 in the RMP, it says Indigenous New Zealand species will generally be used within reserve plantings where appropriate. These will be eco-sourced. So there is a preference for using those already. But the question I had for staff was in the paper it talks about getting quick wins, and I just want to ask whether that we can link that with the Kaimai RMP currently underway. There could be some synergies in the messaging for that, and it could be announced simultaneously, some quick wins alongside the RMP.
Yeah, so we have put a draft policy in the coming reserve management plan for pestary parks that is out for consultation at the moment, assuming it gets adopted.
But if there's particular wins that we might do, so yeah, I understand that the pest management is in the consultation, but if there's things that we can announce simultaneously with adopting the plan, something like that, there might be some wins there.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think Councillor Denyer's had a hard night, but anyway, sorry. Who have I got? Councillor Saul?
Thank you, Madam. Right here, I look at a few things here just the same. And one of them is, and we're talking about it earlier, and that is what and where are we going with this, and what is council's position likely to be as its new job post Three Waters or Waters, and reserves are obviously one of the main things otherwise that we would have left here. So it is an area that we need to manage and be aware of. I would hate to see us just abdicating our responsibilities to groups. So which basically leads me into the other part, and that is, so it progresses along, and basically, I guess we come down to then where it's going to fit and how the MOUs or contracts are going to be administered and formed, because I do believe they need to come back to council under that situation. And I stress that even more because not a lot in here, which is great, but you have used the word partnership. Partnership gives a little bit more grunt than just an agreement. And so I just feel that's important. And that can be in any area here, because again, we're not abdicating entirely, but we're helping fund and leverage a better result. And I really agree with that. And the only areas outside of that that really worry me otherwise is the people outside of our parks and reserves boundaries. But also from there, it concerns me as to how we will come through with a full policy and so on, or full agreement as to where that sits. Because to me, W2FM, which is what's in it for me, often becomes part of what the issue is for outside bodies. I'm not saying it isn't even one for us, what's in it for us, but what's in it for me can often be the thing. Now, the bodies we'd normally be dealing with are right into making the environment better. So it's not an argument against that. It's just whether all of a sudden, somewhere along the line, I would hate to think that we negotiate that they have more, and that's any of the bodies that get an area or a park to look after, some control of use of that park, maybe specific use, without it coming before us, because these are going to be one of the areas that we do control in the future. That would be an area that I would be concerned about with your final, submission of policy to council.
So at the moment, we have a volunteer coordinator, and they've got very good relationships with the reserve volunteers at the moment. And the reserve team is very clear about what they are allowed to do, not allowed to do, what's within their scope, what's council's responsibility, and so on. And so, yeah, a big part of that coordinator's role has been to ensure that the reserve volunteers are, managed in that way so that they're doing what is appropriate.
Right, Councillor Granger.
Thank you. Yes, you skipped over one slide. Said we dealt with it, just this penultimate slide there. But it did reference the national policy on biodiversity or whatever. I can't remember the words. Anyways, on page 35 of your document, it talks about 3.7 and the precautionary approach. Local authorities must adopt a precautionary approach towards proposed activities where the effects on Indigenous biodiversity are uncertain, unknown, or little understood. And I'm wondering how we can possibly comply with that when we are intending to tip a neurotoxin into a water supply, which ultimately ends up in the environment.
Are you talking about sprays? Oh.
What is your suggestion, Councillor Granger?
What?
What is your suggestion? Your
Well,
question?
I'm wondering how council can comply with this national policy statement, which says we must adopt a precautionary approach towards proposed activities where the effects on the Indigenous biodiversity are uncertain, unknown, or little understood. And I would suggest that nobody has ever done a study on the effects of fluoride on our Indigenous biodiversity.
Right.
To clarify that. And yet we're going to tip it into our water and it's going to end up in our environment. So how can we do both?
You have advice? Councillor Granger?
Well, don't tip it in don't put it in the water, then it won't get in the environment. Simple.
Right, Mayor Denyer.
I happened to watch the live stream of the Rotorua meeting where that was covered, and looking at the concentrations, it was basically less than what the receiving environment was. So it was very, very diluted. It was clear there was no, for the health officials were very clear there was just no effect on the environment at all.
Right, and I've Councillor Joyce.
Hi again. I'm just a little bit confused. We're talking about pests and weeds on in our parks and reserves, which is great, and something I've been asking for a bit better work on for a while. But why is this led by the communities team? It just seems a little bit confused. Wouldn't this actually be something that would logically belong with parks and reserves as the asset managers for the parks and reserves? I mean, it's their responsibility to make sure they're well run.
It's partly because a lot of the strategy is around it being a council and community-led initiative. And so the reserves team have definitely been heavily involved in this development of this and will be heavily involved in the delivery of it if it's approved. But in terms of having someone lead it, it's sitting in the community team because it's heavily involved with the community and aligning the community to the strategy.
Right. I mean, Peter Watts's team presumably also works closely with all these groups on its reserves as well. So we just seem to be inserting an extra cog into the wheel. It just seems a bit strange, but if it works, it works. I would suggest that we build into it a review period. I'll say 2 or 4 years, just to make sure that, I love the idea of doing more with what we've got now, but just to make sure we are actually seeing a change and some progress, bearing in mind we're basically, I understand the theme is around getting more out of what we're doing already, and that's great. But just to make sure that after a 2-year or 4-year period that we are actually making progress, that the strategy is working.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. And we will be monitoring all the progress. So one of our first objectives is to build a baseline of the reserves currently so that we can measure progress on it. So we can, then feed into a review later.
Cool, thank you.
So, on that suggestion, should it require a further recommendation that we need a timetable for reporting back to make sure that the council is fully informed as to the progress we're making? And while we're waiting for that, Grant, Councillor Daly, you have a question?
Yeah, just in terms of suggesting, or I mean, suggesting that the social or enterprise or the environmental groups that are we're sort of looking to step up in this to enact the pest-free parks proposal. I was just wondering, Liesl, if you've had conversations with some of the funding organisations. I know Tecton, Bay Trust and Acorn are sort of teaming up to provide a bigger environmental fund, but I just want to make sure that the fact that there might be more applications citing the pest-free parks policy as a reason for the funding that they're requesting, that they won't be disadvantaged by that, and that maybe council sets the scene for those organisations to make sure that they are favourably received. I mean, I've put in quite a few funding applications for various things over the years, and you don't want to be sort of snookered by policies that are perceived to be already covered by other avenues or whatever.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That the Tecton, Bay Trust and a few of the other funders are aware of pest-free parks, that we've been sort of scoping it, but they're not fully across all the details, obviously, as it's not been adopted. So it's a good idea that I could present it to them so they understand what council's going to do and what community is going to do, so that when these community groups do apply, that they have a full understanding of what council's contribution is. And also, a lot of those funders do have a requirement from community groups that council contributes at least 1/3 to the project itself. So this should only enhance their ability to apply for further funding, because we have that sort of commitment in place from council for them.
Yeah, I think every application I've put into tech, they sort of demand a council contribution of at least 50%.
Right. Could I just say that the regional council is responsible for noxious weeds? What role are they having in this process?
So we've spoken to them significantly about the development of the scope, and we've identified a few actions that they can partner with us or align their work programs with us, so we can be more efficient and quite clear around who's responsible for which. So as I've mentioned, they are responsible for the eradication of particular species, and they'll continue to do so. And then they're also going to work with us closely around both how they look after reserve care groups, as some of those reserve volunteer groups are regional council care groups and therefore get funding through them. And we're going to make sure that those care group agreements work in partnership with the reserves team, and it's more efficient for both the groups and the agencies.
Member Clements.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, James, for clarifying the policy. It still then begs the question, what percentage of plants are native as opposed to other non-Indigenous plants in the planting process? So that's, if you can clarify, that'd be useful, because I think if we can be more assertive in that area, it pushes that biodiversity agenda. So it'd be nice to know what percentage currently is, because there would be a marker. If you're having a feedback, current percentage versus a year from now, it's gone from 10% to 20%, then you're making progress. So you've actually got a very hard KPI to measure performance by. The second one is, could you in fact look at the policy in terms of green waste and in fact pest plants, and so that in fact people who take out weeds or noxious weeds are allowed to dump those at the green waste plants at no cost. So in fact, they're cleaning up, they're acting as volunteers to clean up the area and get rid of those plants. I know that in fact, if I look around the neighborhood, around the whole district, agapanthus, I think we'll need a new processing plant just for agapanthus alone. But that would be a positive start to get them out of the process, and education thereafter would help. The other one there, in fact, has just been opened up as a new front, and thank you, Murray, for that, is in fact the whole thing of pesticides, not just chlorine in water, but in fact glyphosate. There's been a $2.1 billion settlement in the States of about the last week for someone, and that stays in and in fact damages the soil at the same time. So the whole issue of what pesticides have been written into our contracts. So if we're going to get rid of noxious weeds, what pesticides are we using, and are they detrimental to the environment? And should that be written into the contracts as well? Which goes back to the point Councillor Sol made as well around policy and around contractors. So maybe you'd like to comment. Thanks.
Yep. So back to the first question about the percentage of native plants on the reserves. So some of that has been mapped to an extent more around the priority biodiversity sites and so on that have been identified for regional council. The first action within the plan to map the reserves will cover that to an extent about how much of the reserves is covered in native biodiversity, and therefore how much do we need to be managing essentially. So the green waste illegal dumping or free disposal for volunteers, there is a group that's getting free of volunteers that have been managing our reserves and so on for particular species that take up a lot of room, like the moth plant pods and so on, they've been previously disposing of them in their personal household waste. We now have an arrangement in place for them to dispose of for free at pardon?
I'm suggesting all ratepayers.
Yeah, so
rather than just in fact just those groups, because they're all ratepayers.
So another part of the action plan is when I was mentioning about socializing internally, a green waste illegal dumping program, behaviour change and education program is already being established in reserves around just teaching people that they're actually a seed source for weed species a lot of the time. We believe there's a big lack of knowledge around that space, and so we're just starting there with education and letting people know that when they're illegally dumping green waste in the reserve, that it is actually the cause of a lot of the weed species that we see. So we're working on that and will continue to do so. And then the last question about the pesticides in use. So those are all have been heavily looked into about what we do use through our contractors. Our reserves team are always working with the contractors to make sure that they're using best practice. And the reserve volunteer coordinator is also always working with the reserve groups closely to make sure that they are working to best practice and that they have the qualifications if they're using pesticides and so on. So they're very strict about what we do use and how we use it. So it's causing the least amount of damage, but realistically, a lot of these species cannot be eradicated without the use of these pesticides.
Well, I'm ready for the mover of the motion, but Councillor Granger.
Sorry.
Yes, it wasn't, it was in fact the ratepayer being able to clean out, say, agapanthus wattles, and you take them to the green waste, not just groups or fly dumping and taking action against them. But in fact, if we can educate the ratepayer to get rid of pest plants in their garden.
Yes, so there is
a policy on that, so that in fact all of the green waste centres are able to, will not charge when it is in fact a pest plant. Now that gives extra administration, I accept, by those centres, but at least it gets rid of those pest plants.
Yes. So as part of the proposed plan, we have some actions around wider community education. The community groups a lot have identified that they would like to do that. For example, Renature and Katikati would like to educate the just general residents, particularly those ones that are neighbouring reserves around this pest species that they might have on their properties and how to manage them. There's also a program from Enviro Hub called Space for Nature that does that. And again, we're going to ask them to align that program so that they're particularly working with the neighbours and around reserves to make sure that they're removing pest species and they know what those species are and where they can take them. In terms of providing a subsidy or something about them taking it to the dump, that's not something that we could do, and it's quite complicated with the weeds. They can't all of the time go into the green waste because they're creating compost out of that, and so then they get the seeds in the compost and they can't resell it. So there's that's why they won't accept it in green waste.
If I just help you with that one, Madam Chair, that kind of issue is dealt with through our waste management and minimisation plan, and so there are, we through that plan we decide how different waste streams are dealt with and who pays, whether user pays or ratepayer or so on. So that's not really relevant to this. It's a good question, but it's not relevant to this, and it's dealt with through our one. So it's just leaving it for that one.
It is a management issue and one that we look forward to having clarification on. Councillor Granger, did you have something further?
No, I'll just second.
Oh, right. So I've got Councillor Henry is ready to move the recommendations, including the one from Councillor Joyce about the timing of reporting back. If that can be included, it's been seconded by Councillor Granger. Now it's time for people to speak. And I'm going to, as chairman, speak. Last night I had a call from someone from Lower Belt Road, and there's been some around Winterbury. I'm not quite sure if it's TCC or Western Bay, but the message has gone in, and there's a whole lot of weed there that has been sprayed and it's not dying, and people are concerned. So working in with developers is really quite important, and I suppose going to be something that you work on as well. And my other comment is, when I first came here, there were serious rats out at Omokoroa, and the community got themselves together and decided they would do something about it. So the voluntary work is really, really important. And when I lived at Ngā Moahine, formed an enhancement group that we worked for local farmers and local community, and we worked with the school at Ngā Moahine School Camp, and we got funding from the regional council on their enhancement grants, and I think it was 19,000, and it was all spent on cleaning up the area up at Ngā Moahine. And the result has been a decidedly improved environment. But the school now is really interested in looking after that. We had a contract for someone to mow, and that wasn't happening. So the school actually mowed that grass as well. And it's been really worthwhile. So the more you can involve the community, the better. But we don't want it to turn into a great thing where you've got all sorts of communities involved, but not necessarily being effective. So keeping it simple and keeping the people involved is really something that needs to happen. Any other speakers? Councillor Scrimgeour.
Is the right one. Yeah, I just want to say I'm fully in support of this program. But I know it was touched on in the questions, but I want to emphasize the importance of whoever person or peoples who survey the reserves and so on and outline the current issues, that it's important that it is someone of good knowledge who understands the different pressures of weeds, the different ways they're spread, whether they just fall on the ground, whether they're spread by birds and animals, or whether they're windborne, and identify the different weeds that are most invasive, where the biggest risks come from. And also from there, once works are underway, being able to explain what is required to people doing the work, because I've been known to get a bit grumpy in my orchard sometimes that little jobs aren't attended to while they're doing something else, and my manager has to remind me that sometimes if you make things too complicated and give too many instructions at once, it doesn't necessarily lead to good outcomes. And so there was something else I wanted to make, but anyway, I think I better stop there, seeing as I've forgotten it. But yeah, I just think it's a good program. The other thing, of course, is that we won't necessarily see a lot of results overnight, and I think it's important that things are reported back, as was said, and there's reviews of the program. And the final point is that fundamental to any weed control program, in my view, is to stop seeding as the starting point. And I think that needs to be taken into account too. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Sol?
Thank you, Madam. Yes. The other part in this was education, and I believe education is extremely important. But I do want to say, basically, the balance of that funding needs to be really looked at with the education. In other words, to me, more doey, less hooey. All right. To me, that's the first part of it. Not spending lots of time having little gatherings and going on. The big thing is before and after pictures. The big thing is to show what you've got now and what your program is achieving. That will then be the biggest achiever of education. That will be the tool that you can really go out with and say, this is what we had, this is what we've got now. So that picture tells 1,000 words is far more important than spending a lot of time up front and watching it go. Let's do the work. That's where I sit, Madam.
Thank you. Any Councillor Henry? Your right of reply.
I think that Western Bay and our volunteers in the community are doing an exceptional job and have done for many years. We are surrounded by our Kaimai ranges, and we have rivers running down into the harbour, and they are being really, with the support of farmers, with initiatives, of course, but becoming more educated about maintaining the water quality, and all groups like that have really supported what we've come to today. But there's education that's happening within the schools, but I think that what you've brought to us today, as I said earlier, is an overarching solid form with parks and reserve, but the community is at the key of this at the moment, and that's why you're here, to be out there and supporting the community. So I fully endorse what we've received today, and I congratulate you. And Jody, I have to say you are doing an excellent job in managing all our community organisations, and with you at the helm, and not to say what you were not doing, but we were at something the other day. You know, there's a consistency that's coming across the Western Bay in terms of that and communicating that message, all our messages with our community. So well done to the both of you. Thank you.
Right, I'll put the motion. Those in favour will say, first of all, I'll read out the third recommendation to make sure that everybody's familiar.
If I can just
Robin?
clarify with the appropriate staff, looking along the lines of that an update on progress of the Pest-Free Park strategy and action plan be reported annually to the community committee.
That's good. So I'll put that in favour, will say aye. Against, carried. Now we have one information for receipt, and you may have an opinion on this, but I don't know that we're able to actually debate it. And any questions? Councillor Coxhead.
So exactly, I mean, it's quite a high level kind of explanation of what it is, and it's so exactly how many schools, what exactly is being taught in terms of sustainability and resilience?
Yep. So the applications have just closed, and they've had 57 schools apply. And that's across the Bay of Plenty region, though. So there's 13 applications from the Western Bay of Plenty. What the Sustainability and Resilience Fund is accepting applications for is anything that kind of increases resilience or sustainability. So that can be gully restorations, stream erosion projects, bush classrooms is quite a popular one, building wetlands, community school gardens, solar power, bike racks. Yeah, that's the sort of stuff that mostly comes through.
Right. No further questions. Mayor Denia.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks, Grant. I was intrigued how some of the funds had, the co-purpose seems to have changed from diverting some to a joint environmental fund to a school sustainability and resilience fund. And I know that through the environmental fund, we did fund school programs and veggie gardens and educative things like that. So I was intrigued as to how much of the fund is going towards hard environmental projects as opposed to educating school kids about the environment, which is worthy in itself, but it's a slightly different focus from where we were. And I don't know if you have any information as to how much of our environmental fund or community matching fund in the environment section went to schools already, and how much went to other groups.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have the numbers on what was spent historically around schools and community groups. The reason that we went with the School Sustainability and Resilience Fund was we were looking at two options. One was this, and one was another joint environmental fund that wasn't formed, but we were looking at forming it. We decided that it wasn't going to be viable. There wasn't enough interest from the funders. And we felt that if we didn't have all the funders on board, it wasn't really achieving the goals of trying to find one fund for applicants to apply to rather than having to go to multiple funds. And so we kind of needed all funds on board. And so, we essentially weren't meeting the needs of what we were kind of doing. But through that, we did sort of identify a few things that we could improve on for our own funds individually. So that's why we didn't go with the joint fund and have gone with the School Sustainability Fund. The School Sustainability Fund also does do on the ground projects. It's not about education. So it's tangible projects that are achieved through this fund.
My concern is that we have a lot of pressure going on our outside trust. And this, the Ngāmoehine example that I gave before, is a perfect example of where the regional council was the one that stepped in and was prepared to actually fund. And having digressed it and expecting everybody else to come up with this, our matching fund is not a big amount of money, and we've cut it back over the period of time. A council is satisfied that this is the right course of action. Mayor Denia.
Sorry, so I hadn't quite finished my point previously, but we haven't cut back the CMF, and this is just a redirection of 20,000 of the environmental section. So it's not a huge amount, and I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill here, but and I support the fund we're redirecting it to. My concern was, are we biasing it too far towards that one particular area as opposed to a wider environmental benefit outside of what schools do?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think what we have seen with some of the projects where it's worked with schools is that they are also working with other community groups on those projects. But I think what would be useful would be the fund is just closed. We can report back to you at the June community committee meeting on what got funded in the Western Bay area and what those projects look like, because we actually don't know what those funding decisions are going to be yet. And then the committee can consider what you want to do in the next financial year. Do you want to continue to contribute to the school fund, or do you want to flick that funding back into the CMF Environmental Fund?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, Jodie. Just a follow up that question: who is actually making the decision on this fund? Are we involved at some level at all?
That was one of the reasons we quite liked this fund, is that it's a participatory budget model. So the general public can vote. They have so much money, and then they can vote on the projects. And then the projects that don't make it through in that round then go to a youth panel. So that youth panel then decides on the has its own sort of portion to allocate and then make the decisions as well. So it's quite a community driven fund, which
Who
we quite like.
decided that?
That's how it was already set up. So this has been a fund set up by Regional Council for 2 or 3 years now, and that's the model that they had already in place.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Henry.
So I don't know whether these figures are correct, but online, the community matching fund is 140,000, 100 of which is a general fund and 40,000 environmental fund. So that means that the school are actually getting effectively half of.
A third.
No.
So there was 60 for the environmental fund, and we're
Okay, so
redirecting
that's
20.
gone into that.
Yeah.
Jody, you had an explanation as well? Okay. Councillor Sol, please.
Thank you. I just need to question that again. So where is this funding coming from? As I understood it, whilst it's a small sum of money, $20,000, it's quite a large lump, I think, which is what Councillor Henry is saying, of the community matching fund that we have to distribute, focused in our district. And that's what partially concerns me. It is a small sum of money, and it probably can be found in another area to go towards this project, so that we can continue to focus what we do have within our community matching fund. That's sort of what I was at the understanding of. So, you know, if you're going to take that sum, it's something that we can't direct ourselves into our own local district.
We're not going to have a debate on whether or not we shift this $20,000. That was decided donkeys ages ago.
Okay.
Councillor Daly.
Yeah, obviously, at our chair's briefing, we discussed this particular point. James was present, as well as Margaret. But yeah, it is a bit of a concern that the community matching fund for the environment projects is reduced from 60 to 40, especially in light of the pest-free parks proposal that we just put forward, which is likely to elicit more funding requests to support that initiative. And we're effectively cutting back on that, and cutting back on it even more with this focus on the school initiatives. But so I do welcome the review for next year, but my suggestion at the briefing was perhaps we may need to find this 20,000 from another source and either retain the 60,000 in the matching fund, or even give it a bit of a boost, considering where we're going with pest-free parks. And that's obviously a discussion for another day. But could I ask one question? What is the total fund for this particular fund that we're contributing to?
So this year, the total funding available is $165,000.
Okay. So we haven't done too bad with 14 applications, I
Jody,
guess.
did you want to say something?
No, it was just
Okay,
answer that
Councillor
question.
Andy.
So just for clarification, so is the community matching funds of 50-50, we're chucking 20K in it. Does it still retain that the matching element of it, or is this like, here, take it?
It's slightly different in that regional council match. Yeah, so we still only contribute 50% to each project, and then regional council does the other match.
Right, thank you. Well, I'll move the recommendation that the information be received and that we report back as to its success in the following year. Seconder, Councillor Granger. Well, we've just made one. I'll put it, those in favour will say aye, against carried. And that